From the campus of the University of Kentucky, you're listening to Behind the Blue. I'm Cody Kaiser with UK Strategic Communications.
When you have autobiographical fiction, what's so fascinating about it is that in some ways you can risk being even more honest because you're able to hide behind the guise of fiction. It's got an autobiographical bent. You're intentionally teasing the reader. You're asking them to wonder what's real and what's not real. And because of that, there are certain confessions that I think you can include in an autobiographical novel that you might not want to include in a memoir because it's too personal, it's too much. But because you're hiding behind fiction and it's with a slant about you, you have the possibility of saying, oh no, that's not me, even if it is me. But maybe it's not me, and I'll never tell.
That's UK English professor Hannah Pittard talking about her latest novel, If You Love It, Let It Kill You, released in early July. Known for her captivating storytelling and introspective explorations of identity and relationships, Pittard's new book delves into themes of self-perception, control, and the blurred lines between autobiography and fiction. On this episode of Behind the Blue, Pittard shares the unexpected inspiration behind the novel, how writing autofiction allows her a unique form of honesty, and the delicate balance between darkness and humor in storytelling. She also discusses the art of revision, the influence of her students on her creative process, and the courage required to stay true to her artistic vision, even when faced with skepticism from others. Hannah Pittard, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about your new book. Can you tell us a little bit about the premise of your new novel? And your novel is called If You Love It, Let It Kill You, which there's a lot of subtext there that's unspoken maybe that you kind of dig into. But tell us a little bit about the premise of it and the main character and what she's facing in this.
Absolutely. This is a book that I didn't intend to write. It sort of fell into my lap. I am a fiction writer by trade, but my book before this was a memoir. If You Love It, Let It Kill You is a book about a middle-aged woman who is terrified of domesticity and craves stability. It's very much a book about the human heart in conflict with itself. And the premise, I suppose, I do think it's a very hard book to categorize, but if I had to say what the sort of back jacket premise is, a midlist novelist discovers that she is soon to appear in her ex-husband's debut novel, and the portrait of her in his book is unflattering, and this inability to control her image or how she's been portrayed or characterized by him sends her into or down a kind of descent of madness. And so I think it's very much a picaresque. Lots of exciting things happen. I don't know that there's a plot. I've never been really good at plot, but I'm good at creating momentum through surprising juxtapositions. And that's what this story is. It's a romp. It's a wild romp. It's a comedy, but it's definitely a dark comedy.
Well, I was going to say the tone has been kind of described as a dark comedy. Is that kind of indicative of maybe the emotional space that you were in while you were working on this, or?
I don't think there's a darkness to me at all, but I think that I wanted this book to have a lot of verticality and depth. And on the one hand, it could have simply been a kind of family, not drama, a family comedy really, but I wanted something more to that. And I'm a person who is drawn to humor that pits high and low, dark and light. And so in order for me to want to spend time with this book and want to spend time with the levity of this book, I also wanted to weight it down with a kind of seriousness and darkness. So I wouldn't say that my headspace was darkly comedic, but definitely it's the space that this novel lives in, for sure.
Compared to a memoir, writing something like this, do you feel like there was more vulnerability in writing this, or does a memoir does that create more vulnerability because you're speaking as you versus you're able to funnel things through a character?
That's a really good question, and it's something that I think and write a lot about the intersection between memoir and autobiographical fiction. So a memoir tends to be about a very particular event or moment in a person's life, right? As opposed to an autobiography or a biography, which is more sweeping and holistic. And there is certainly, especially with the memoir I wrote, which is about my divorce, there's a vulnerability and an exposure that you're making of yourself. You're putting yourself on display, and you're also attempting to be truthful and honest. And you're staying within the confines of what happened or what you believe happened, right? You're staying within the confines of your memory. When you have autobiographical fiction, what's so fascinating about it is that in some ways you can risk being even more honest because you're able to hide behind the guise of fiction. It's got an autobiographical bent. You're intentionally teasing the reader. You're asking them to wonder what's real and what's not real. And because of that, there are certain confessions that I think you can include in an autobiographical novel that you might not want to include in a memoir because it's too personal, it's too much. But because you're hiding behind fiction and it's with a slant about you, you have the possibility of saying, oh no, that's not me, even if it is me. But maybe it's not me, and I'll never tell.
I like that it's a kayfabe, to coin a phrase from like professional wrestling or old carnival type stuff. Like I'm telling you some things, two truths and a lie kind of thing. Where
Absolutely. I think the very act of writing autofiction is a performance, and I'm very interested in the performance of identity. I think that's something that a lot of people, not everybody, struggles with every single day. What portion of themselves to present to the world, and what portion of yourself to present to your family versus your friends versus your students or your colleagues. And then there's the person you are when no one is in the room with you. And that's even, I think, more exciting and somewhat dangerous in a really interesting way. And, when I write, I'm the only person in the room. And that is an opportunity for me to try on a bunch of different disguises. And in this case, the case of If You Love It, Let It Kill You, the character I am impersonating is me, which is pretty fun. It was a difficult book to write, but it was also the most fun I've ever had writing a novel.
And even has the same name, albeit a different spelling, correct?
Yes. Oh, Hannah P.
Yeah.
Hana. My joke with my family is that there's just something a little missing about her. There's something missing. I think my mom might have said a heart. Is that what's missing?
I think it's interesting. There have been plenty of books written by authors writing about authors. So from a pop culture kind of standpoint, Stephen King comes to mind. I think he has a couple of different books that are the main character is an author.
Yes.
And so that's one path that people have gone down. This feels so different because it's a writer discovering that she's being written about. Like that feels like such a new twist on that. I find that interesting. That and it kind of allows you to kind of mine new territory out of that.
Well, I think A lot of fiction writers navigate the world in a really interesting way where we are constantly mining the people around us for material. Maybe we're mining our family for material, maybe the workplace or strangers. I think the novelist Lauren Groff, who wrote Fates and Furies, there's a quote from her about how there's not a person she's met on the street that she hasn't, in her mind, turned upside down and shaken everything out of their pockets to see what's in there, what's going on, and what can I steal for my fiction. And so I am somebody who, like a lot of other fiction writers, I've just naturally done that in my entire life. And without trying always never to grossly trespass. And when I found out that, and this happened in my real life, when I found out that my ex-husband was going to publish a novel and that an unflattering portrait of a character who sounded a lot like me was going to be included, that was a moment of unexpected introspection for me, where I started to think about what it was to be the person being appropriated or the character being used in somebody else's fiction. And believe it or not, that's not something I'd really spent a lot of time thinking about. I'd spent a lot of time thinking about what's fair and what's not fair, what stories are mine to tell and what are not mine to tell. And I have pretty good ideas about what makes me feel okay and what makes me feel bad about borrowing from other people's lives. But this was the first time that I really had to reckon with my life being used for somebody else's art. And at the end of the day, this book is really, truly about a writer who is a lot like me, muddling through that realization. And at the end of the book, there is an epiphany. And the epiphany that my persona, Hannah P., has is an epiphany that I actually had in real life that I was not intending to have. I didn't mean to have, but the act of writing this book brought me there. And it's something that, I finished this book in 2024. That epiphany holds true still. And I don't want to articulate it just because I don't want to give anything away. And I would love for people to, check this book out from the library or read it or, buy it if you want to.
This book, the voice in this book, can be maybe perceived as sharp, self-aware, but sometimes spiraling. Are there things that you developed in the writing of this book or skills that you take to your writing that you maybe hadn't had before or hadn't had a lot of time to really work on, that you really maybe felt like you were kind of developing, that you can take forward on the next thing that you write? And also, let me ask too, I kind of want to know, because this book doesn't feel like there was an intentionality behind it that was necessarily, like, it felt like this book kind of, was there something else that maybe you had in the back of your head that this is going to be in my next project, and then it became this book instead?
So I'll start by saying I've been writing long enough and intensely enough that when I sit down and put words on a page, the style and the voice that I'm using is instinctive at this point. So on the one hand, there's a character I'm performing, but the one thing I'm not performing is the style and the voice. It's just so organic to me at this point. And you're right that there was no intentionality when I sat down to create this. I think for me as a writer, intentionality always comes in the revision process. And when a project is still new and still being shaped, I like to not know where I'm going, because I am a person who likes to be surprised by what I might discover in the process of, being alone in a room and writing and just tapping into my imagination. And if I do have a plan in place, I find that I'm pretty stilted as a writer, and all of that sort of instinctive style and instinctive voice becomes more difficult. So I write really well when I don't. It's like in a bowling alley. If I need not to have the kid blockers up on the sides, right? Like the ball needs to just be able to go anywhere, including on somebody else's lane, perhaps, and maybe knock over their pins. But in the revision process, that's where I think it's so essential for me. Everybody has different ways of creating a large scale project like a novel. But for me, the revision process is where I start to refine, I start to notice themes, I start to understand how I got from point A to point B to point C and what I need to do to make those transitions even more effective and, to distill everything to make it its richest, most immediate self. So, yeah.
Do you have an editor that you work with?
I do have an editor. I've had several different editors for my second, third, and fourth books. I had the same editor. And then for the memoir, I moved houses and I had a young editor who was also a fiction writer herself. And she helped me shape the memoir so that it was, I use this metaphor a lot with my students that sugar water is really awesome, but it's even more awesome if you put it over heat and you boil it down so that what's left is, something richer and denser and more intense and more alive at the bottom. That syrup, it's just so much more interesting than sugar water. And so I would say that what my editor did with the memoir was something similar. She helped me focus it into this razor sharp narrative. And what's interesting about If You Love It, Let It Kill You, I've sold a bunch of books at this point to different publishing houses, and each one I've sold in a different way. My debut was a completed project. I think the editor changed maybe 4 or 5 words, and we had just a couple additions that were made to that book. So it was so polished before I even dared to send it off to an agent. And then my second book was like a shell of itself. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then we sold it to an editor, and she really helped me build it out. So the opposite of distilling. It was like scaffolding without any of the building materials, or a skeleton without the flesh. And so she really helped me flesh it out. My third book I sold on spec, is what we say. It was a partial. It was maybe 60 or 70 pages. And I was able to sort of bounce ideas off my editor, but it wasn't at the line level. It was more like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? But ultimately, I kind of did that on my own as well. All of this brings me to If You Love It, Let It Kill You, which was another book I sold on spec to the editor who'd purchased the memoir. And I let her read 50 pages, and she loved it. And the 50 pages that she'd read I didn't mean to be misleading when I showed her those first 50 pages, but they leaned into Arrested Development slapstick family comedy. I always knew there was going to be a darkness to it, but those were the 50 pages that were cohesive. She read it. She loved it. She said, let's get a book deal in place. So we signed. And then I thought I'd be working on it with her, but I wasn't. And I worked on this book all by myself for about a year, not turning in pages. And in that year is when the darkness really came out. And also, I think a different kind of humor, less slapsticky, not sinister, but unhinged. Let's say unhinged. I think there's a certain amount of unhinged comedy, and If You Love It, Let It Kill You. And when I turned it into her on time, by the way, you get a deadline in these cases. And when I turned it into her, she waited, I knew there was something wrong, because typically she gets back to me pretty quickly. And a week went by, and 2 weeks went by, and then 4 weeks went by, and then 8 weeks went by. And finally, we did a Zoom. Actually, I was in POT on the 12th floor, and we did a Zoom phone call. And she said, "Is there any other book? Do you have any other book?" And I said, I was very surprised by this. I knew that there was going to be some amount of work to do, because what I handed in was a draft, and I thought that we would revise together. And she said, "This doesn't have to be the book." And I said, "This does have to be the book." And she said, "Take the weekend, think about it." So I got off the phone with her, immediately called my agent and said, "Did you know about this?" And she said, "I got a phone call right before she Zoomed with you. So I knew it was coming, but I too am surprised." And I said, "Well, you're the only other person who's read it. What do you think?" And she said, "I love this book. This is the book." And she said, "But take the weekend, make sure." And so, I pretended to take the weekend. And then on Monday morning, I emailed my editor and I said, "This is the book." And she said, "Okay." And she was just resigned. And so she offered me 3 pages of very tiny sized font notes about what I should change. And in the meantime, I also sent it to a trusted reader out in California who's a really close friend of mine. And she read it, and she sent me her own 3 pages, very small font. And I looked at both of the edits or the notes, and my editors were bad. It was she wanted me to write a book or rewrite a book that didn't exist. And my friend in California, she gave me notes that were for the book in front of her and how to make it a better version of itself. So I ignored my editor's notes. I took my friend's notes. I revised the book. I turned it back in, and my editor said, "Well, this is certainly your vision." And I said, "It is my vision." And so we ended up moving forward, publishing this book. I knew that she didn't particularly like it. And I'm so glad that I listened to myself and my agent and my friend, and not to her. And that I do think there's something really wonderful about being a full professor and being somebody who is middle-aged and somebody who has written multiple books, because you get to a point, there's a kind of freedom to create and express yourself. And with this book, I decided not to compromise in a way that with other editorial suggestions in the past I had. And this, in some ways, this goes back to your earlier question about voice and style and what was intentional and not intentional. The one thing I knew when I'd finished that first draft, and then as I was rewriting and revising, was that I wanted this to be a book that I loved and that I was proud of at every level and on every page. And I think that the response to it, it's gotten quite a bit of attention, and it's gotten rave reviews from the Washington Post, Atlanta Journal, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and from a bunch of different types of reviewers. And they all love the book, and they all see something really profound about it. And I think that if I'd made some of those compromises that the editorial direction was asking for, it wouldn't have the legs that it actually has now. So I'm very grateful for the position I am in, and that I was able to take a risk and experiment in the way I wanted to experiment.
Totally random aside, but I recently watched a movie from 1967 with Lee Marvin called Point Blank, directed by John Boorman. And it's based on a book, but Lee Marvin and John Boorman got together and they practically threw out everything. Later on, the script, I think they made the Mel Gibson movie Payback.
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's right.
So the Lee Marvin movie is very different from this. And I don't think it got a lot of traction at the time, but in retrospect, it's looked at as like just a classic. It's just a great film, tight pacing, and it's just really, really good. And Lee Marvin actually, had script approval and talked to the studio and said, I have approval of principal cast. They said yes. He said, I defer all of these approvals to John Boorman. who had never really, I don't think he directed a ton of stuff. But after it was put together and the studio looked at it, they were kind of mumbling about reshoots, the executives were. And Margaret Booth, who was a supervising film editor who worked for MGM, I think maybe she worked on Ben-Hur,
Oh, wow.
like big films,
Yeah.
told Borman, apparently this is anecdotal, as Borman walked out of the screening, touch one frame of this film over my dead body.
I love it.
And really went to bat for it and stood up. And, they just were very uncertain about it, but it turned into just and it just made me think about that in that context of like, sometimes you have to let something be and maintain that vision.
Absolutely.
And people will get it.
That's right.
People
That's
will
right.
get it.
Yeah.
And so this was a good example of that. What you're saying is right in line with that. That like sometimes, I know that we put our faith and our resources into people who are helping us craft things, but nobody's perfect. And sometimes people are off a little bit on their perception of it.
I think that's right. And especially, I have great admiration for the publishing industry, and I feel incredibly lucky to have published so many books. But I do think that there is a desire, and it makes sense to me, that a publicity team or a marketing team, they want to be able to categorize things. That's easy. If you can put it in a package and say, this is a beach read, this is a comedy, this is a tragedy, this is historical fiction. But sometimes there are things that exist outside those categories, and they are difficult to understand. And what I believed is that if I trusted my reader, people would get it. That if they were willing to invest in the 7 hours it takes to read it, that they would have a satisfying experience, even if they couldn't necessarily say what category of fiction this weird beast goes into.
Well, and there's a lot to be said about the idea that you could have done these things, and you always would have had that question in the back of your head of what could this have been if I'd stuck with my intentions on this, if I hadn't followed that.
Absolutely. And my fourth novel, I've written every book that's been published at the University of Kentucky except for my debut and my second novel. I was still in edits when I was hired in 2014. But my fourth book I wrote, I think I was on pre-tenure course release. Maybe I was actually on sabbatical. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, the point is, I wrote my fourth novel while I was at the University of Kentucky, and I was going through a divorce, I was teaching, and I was under deadline. And my editor wanted me to get rid of some of the experimentation that was initially very important to me to include in that book. It's quote unquote historical. It takes place in 1962. I say quote unquote historical because my father is driven crazy when I call fiction from 1960s historical, but that's just a category, right? It's just a way that the publishing industry talks about it. But it's a book that takes place in Atlanta. It begins with a real life plane crash, and initially in an early draft of the book, the city of Atlanta had a voice, and it had multiple chapters, and it had this very strange kind of participation in the narrative. And my editor said, get rid of it. And because of the circumstances, because she wanted it to be a beach read, because she wanted it to be a commercial success, because I was going through a divorce, because I was also teaching and I was feeling completely stressed, I gave in to those edits and I made it a more mainstream novel than I wanted it to be. And it did well. People liked it. I still hear from people today that it's their favorite book. But for me, just like you said, sometimes I think about what that book could have been if I'd really, if I'd said, we need to extend the deadline. No, Atlanta's got to stay in there as a character. I just haven't succeeded yet. I'll convince you if I slow down, take the time. But I didn't do any of that. I didn't fight for the book, and I didn't fight for my artistic vision of my initial artistic vision. And so I just checked off the boxes and I turned it in. And because of that, it's the book that I'm most disappointed in. It's like I have 6 children, and that's the one who's always disappointing me.
I can see where it's hard to do that, though, especially, earlier in a career, of knowing when to push back and when not to, and when to kind of, just leave well enough alone, in a sense, or like, to navigate that career-wise. I can see where that would be really, really stressful. Not everybody can be a George Lucas that decides Star Wars is never going to be finished. Like, I'm going to tinker with this film forever, or I'm going to write this book and then come out later. And I don't know many people who do an author's edit rewrite, like so many films have director's cuts.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Henry James did, and he would rewrite novels later in his career to, depending on which versions you like, some would say to their detriment. But I have considered, like, what would it look like if I went back and revised this book and rewrote it? But I'm also a writer who's very interested constantly in doing new things and trying new genres, taking that organic, instinctive manner in which I write, that voice, that style that isn't an effort, and putting it towards something that will be an effort, that is a challenge to me. So the idea of going back and revising a book that's already been published, I think I would find that pretty soul crushing in some ways, because I always am chasing something new and something different and challenging. It's just what's interesting.
Well, and like you said, you have 6 kids, in a sense, and sometimes you just have to let those children grow up to be what they're going to be.
Absolutely.
And you love them for what you might perceive as imperfections, but that just makes them unique, and that's who they are, or
well said.
What the book is. Themes or areas of, like, self-reflection and navigating identity, kind of finding yourself. To make a bit of a tangent, this feels like a very big part of what students go through. And so to kind of transition a little bit to talk about your work here, working with students, teaching, how does that influence the way you think about those ideas of identity and self-perception, introspection? Does your work with students, how does it inform that as far as your personal work?
Teaching is a very humbling experience. A professor is expected to be the expert in the room, and it is my goal to be an expert in the room. I think at the beginning of my career teaching, I was in my early 20s, I was in my 20s when I started teaching, and I think I had this belief that in order to be taken seriously, I needed to be the expert in the room. I needed to know the most about everything. And over the course of 20 years, what I've realized, and I think this has made me a much better teacher, is that I don't have to be the expert in the room. I just have to be an expert in the room who knows the material, but is also open to hearing other ideas and other bouts of expertise from my students. And I think there's one of the reasons I've been able to let go a little bit in the classroom is because of the confidence I have in my abilities as a teacher, and because I am so familiar with the material that I'm teaching. But my students have definitely, again, it's a 20-year career at this point. My students have helped me. I'm honestly, I'm just like continually surprised by them. And I've walked into classes where I've expected perhaps a short story that's written by one of my students, that it's a weaker piece. There are a lot of typos. Maybe there's not an ending. It feels rushed. Perhaps it's even like actually sloppy. Like it doesn't seem as though the writer reread it. And I've walked into some of those classes really quite terrified that a student's peers might tear that story apart. And I am always blown away in moments like this, and also reminded to try to let go of certain assumptions. But almost always in cases like that, I walk in and my students are more generous than I think they're going to be. You know, I don't have a classroom where we ignore laziness on the page, but I do have a classroom where I like to start with praise. Always. There's always something. There's always a nugget of beauty in a student story. It might be tiny, but there's always something there. And I make my students look for that. And I always look for it too. And the reason I do that, the reason we have to start with praise, is because personally, as a writer, I cannot hear you. If you've read a draft of something I've written, if you're my editor, if you're my agent, if you're my friend in California, I cannot hear what you're going to say that is good advice if we don't start with something positive. If you start right off, if a sentence begins with, I have a problem with, my ears just, they go, it's like a kid saying like, I need this, instead of saying, please, may I have, right? Like, I need the magic words in order to hear the good advice. And so in my classroom, we always start with positivity, but we also eventually get to the part where I ask my students to let me do this part because it is my role in the classroom. But we'll always get to a portion of the workshop where I say, so listen, this reads to me as though you didn't have time to give it a second read. And maybe that's because you weren't taking it as seriously as you should have been, or maybe that was because you ran out of time. But I see that. And next time I want more. Next time I want the assignment to feel completed, and I want it to feel more polished than it does. But all of this to say, my students have completely influenced me because I also started this career thinking there was one type of genre that I was interested in. And that was sort of like working class, what they might call dirty Kmart realism. There are no talking cats and there are no vampires. And, ideally, a story that a student might write was, my grandma's dying, or my parents are getting a divorce, like real world problems. And what I always believed at the beginning, what I believed as a teacher, was that world building, which is what a lot of young people want to do, because that's what they like reading, books and stories where new worlds have been created. What I always told them was, world building is so hard that if you focus on that in your first piece of writing, you're never going to get to the important part, which is character development and plot and all of these other things. And what I've understood over the course of 20 years, and especially since COVID, I think, what I've come to understand is world building is not hard for my students. It's hard for me. I'm not interested in world building because it's not a muscle that I have chosen to develop or flex. But my students love it and they're good at it. And once it's a lot of letting go a certain amount of control. Once I realized that these different types of genres that didn't necessarily appeal to me, not only appealed to them, but were easy for them, it made my teaching stronger, and it made, I think, my students a lot more excited to be in the classroom. And the beautiful thing about being a teacher, and especially a teacher of 20 years, is that I am at a point where I might not be able to write a fill in the blank, a futuristic Star Wars type narrative myself, but I can certainly read a story by one of my students who have done that, and I can help them. I just address it as, how can I make this thing in front of me the best version of itself? Not, how can I take this futuristic Star Wars type thing and turn it into dirty Kmart realism when it doesn't want to be that? And so absolutely, they have influenced me in that way. And I think it's made me, I enjoy teaching even more.
Is that two sides of the same coin in a sense, in that if you look at character development and being able to work through problems that any author may have, like personal things, you work out your personal things through this character development. And I want to see how I can get these constructs, these characters in my mind through these situations and what may happen. I'm going to work through this. Is it not maybe also the other side of that same coin of I'm going to build this world where these problems don't exist in that way, or they exist in a different way, and we've worked our way? Like, are you, as an author, maybe are you still doing kind of the same kind of work of like working through your own things, issues, problems, perceptions, but you're just doing it in at a different scale, maybe?
Yeah, I think I'm absolutely open to that idea. I also think there are a lot of, I mean, what's so exciting for me being in a classroom with undergraduates, especially, you know, students who are still 18 to 22 and figuring out what identity they want to present to the world and who they are and what their interests are. You know, they're still very nascent, I think. I actually believe that a lot of them are able to create these worlds and they're not working through anything. They're just tapping into their imaginations. Not every writer imbues their writing with a sense of themselves, or not every writer uses their writing to sort of make sense of the world around them. That is certainly what I do. But again, this is just, having to reconsider a lot of how we interact with one another post-COVID. I think students come at it in a million different ways, and there's just no one way. But certainly there is a student who is using world building in the way that I use character development. Absolutely.
I like that idea too that you mentioned of finding that one nugget that is good, that is something that you can build upon, and focusing on that as opposed to the criticism that you might take in or look at. It almost reminds me of the idea of training to be able to know what counterfeit money is.
Oh.
And I've always heard that when they train, whether it's whoever in the government that does that, they only look at actual money. They only look at actual dollar bills or $50 bills or whatever. And they learn that so well that then when you see something that is counterfeit, that's what sets it off, because you know the truth. So you're building on that foundational good. So I'm building on this. This is the perfect. This is the way it's supposed to be.
I love that.
And then when I see something that is not that, then I immediately go, well, that's not real, or and that's counterfeit. And so I think of that in that idea of like, if I'm looking at what I did well in this particular piece, and then I'm not copying it, but I'm building on it. I'm scaffolding out from that. Then you're not fixating on the negative and like that idea of, I have to avoid doing these things. And instead of being in that mindset of avoidance, you're in more of the mindset of construction of, this is what works and well, and let me build this out.
That's a metaphor that I'm absolutely going to use. Thank you. That's awesome.
Sure.
Yeah, I love it.
What do you expect from your students, not just in terms of like writing, but how they approach the creative process? And I know is your expectation that they just, because they are young, is there theory that you want them to kind of grasp at the beginning?
What I want from my students is for them to, honestly, I want them to understand that ambition is a good thing, that trying for something hard and failing is really important. I think sometimes students limit themselves and they say, well, I can't do this perfectly, so I'm going to do that instead. It's less hard, it's less rigorous, it will be less interesting, but I can complete that and it will be a polished nugget. And I am more interested in having them push themselves, take risks, and see what they can learn about themselves and the world on the other side of it. I also think it's really easy for a young person, because it's easy for me and I'm no longer a quote unquote young person, but it's really easy to walk through this world and criticize it. Finding the flaws in something is typically really easy. And that makes it sometimes like shooting fish in a barrel. To make fun of something is pretty small because it is so easy. What's harder is looking up at the world and finding something that's actually beautiful. And one of the early assignments that doesn't have anything to do with writing, but I'm really encouraging them to start paying attention to the world around them, to the environment around them. I ask them to leave the first day of class and on their way to their next class or on their way back to their dorm or their apartment or to lunch with their friends to find something that's beautiful, whatever it is. Look up, right? Look up at the world. Stop looking at your phone. Put your phone away. We have hawks all over this campus. I stop every time I see one and watch it as long as I can until it goes out of sight. It's beautiful, right? So perhaps a student is walking through their particular day and they're having a bad day and nothing looks beautiful because of how they feel inside. It's a challenge. And the minute you can start to see things that are beautiful, it just opens up your perspective and it broadens your horizon. And that, more than anything, is what I want from my students. I would also like them to expect more from themselves, and to read more closely, always read more closely, and put your phone down and interact with the world. Make eye contact if you can make eye contact, and listen to what people are saying around you and the way that people are saying things, because this is your life, right? Every single day, this is your life. And I think a lot of young people get to campus and they're taught this by their parents or they're taught this in their high schools, that you have to get to college and you need to get all A's and succeed in order to start your life on the other side and get that job. But if you're always looking for the thing in front of you, if you're always only focused on the future, you get that first job and then you're looking for the promotion or you're looking for the way to move to the next job. When are you ever living your life? Because what will happen is that you'll get to 60 and you'll think, I did all of that for what? Who am I? So I'm just very interested in a holistic student and helping them find beauty, expand their empathy skills, and be curious. I think more, if I had to distill all of what I just said, I would ask for students to come into a classroom curious.
You mentioned COVID and the challenge of that time. And I honestly, based on conversations I've had with a lot of faculty, I think that in some ways we're going to be in that time for quite some time, quite a while. It affected, an entire generation of students from first grade through high school. And I think that we're seeing that, and we're going to continue to see that at the college level and how it affected people, not just in academic performance, but interpersonally, and what their perception of the world is like, how they go about their interaction with the world. Talk a little bit about that and maybe some other challenges that you've seen in this current generation of student writers, and maybe what you do to try to navigate through that.
Attention spans are shorter than ever. It's so difficult to focus on one thing for an extended amount of time. And I blame COVID in part, but obviously technology is a huge part of that as well. We are there are distractions everywhere. It's almost impossible to walk through a building, to walk from one building to another and not have 1,000 screens. Like, you're either passing them in people's hands or you're literally walking through a building where there are televisions on the wall. So there are so many ways to be distracted right now. And if you are somebody who if you are a young person who experienced COVID, it makes sense that you would be especially vulnerable to those distractions. So unlearning distraction seems like a huge challenge. But it is a challenge. The short attention spans is one thing. The distractions of screens and technology is something else that I'm constantly having to navigate and figure out. The other thing is, it seems to me that our students and also us, we are more connected to the world than ever because of these tiny computers that we keep in our back pockets. You can text someone in China and talk to someone in India and watch a YouTube of a person surfing in California all at the same time. So technically connected, right, in this global kind of way. But I also feel the other side of that is we are more disconnected and more isolated than ever because that connection comes by looking down at a small screen. So if you were to black out anything on the screen, what you're looking at is a human being looking down at a glass and plastic object. And that feels so bad to me. That feels so insular and frightening and alone. So in my classroom, and I guess, I understand this is just like so granular because it's just in my classroom that I'm doing this, but I know that there are faculty in other classrooms that are doing it as well. But, one class at a time, one student at a time, just trying to help remind them in case there was a time when they were familiar with, a larger sense of the world, remind them or introduce them to a larger sense of the world. And one of the techniques that I use in the classroom is there's no technology in the classroom. And I think that there are some faculty who would quote Marv Levy here and say, if you don't change with the times are going to change you. And that is, I quote Marv Levy a lot as well. And I think in many ways as a teacher, I have changed. I've changed with the times in order to accommodate changing culture, changing society. I absolutely believe in being flexible and being able to let go of certain expectations for myself as a professor. But the reason that I've chosen not to embrace technology in the classroom is that I'm not sure where students are getting a break from it. And I can ensure that they have an hour and 15-minute break from it in my classroom. And maybe they're bored out of their mind, but boredom is often the beginning of creativity. So ideally, they're focused on what I'm saying or what a guest speaker is saying or what we're discussing that day, but maybe their mind is wandering and they're actually imagining things that typically they wouldn't be because they'd be looking at their phone. That's okay with me too. Again, ideally, they're focused on what's happening in the classroom, but that hour and 15-minute reprieve, it can't be bad for them. It cannot be bad from them. So far, I have not seen any study that putting your phone down for an hour and 15 minutes is actually harmful. It's like everything is the opposite.
You mentioned the texting with a person in China and speaking to someone in India. And sometimes I think that the act of doing this, of finding a larger community, it's a bigger world out there. And I find people with like interests or like-minded people. I think, sometimes I look at that and I think that's great, but there are people surrounding you that you could interact with, and perhaps those people you don't see eye to eye with, perhaps those people you don't get along with. And maybe that's why we don't feel a connected we don't feel any kind of connectivity with the people around us because they don't get us or we don't get them. But I often think about that in the sense of like learning to navigate your own community, learning to meet people where they are, and that works both ways. Not doing that, instead seeking out somebody on the other side of the planet, I think ultimately is going to be potentially harmful for us as people because we can't function in our own communities sometimes because of the fact that it's easier to just find what we're looking for elsewhere as opposed to kind of going through any kind of growing pains locally.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely a person who is more of both and than either or. So I think if a person finds pleasure and community and depth in connecting to people on the other side of the world, that's wonderful. But does it have to come at the exclusion of also being part of a community here, in the place where you're living, in a place where you can actually go and, look into the whites of someone's eyes and make a connection that way. I think both is great, but one or the other, I can understand how that would be limiting. Yeah.
Your work as an author clearly has an impact on your approach to teaching. Are there lessons from your own writing life that you pass on to your students? Are there things that you warn them about, or that what do you pass on to your students from your own life, and how does it maybe, as your career has gone on, how has it shaped kind of your approach in the classroom?
Well, yes. So I constantly give real world examples to my students. The reason I tell them, I'm very interested in being transparent in a classroom. So I tell them why we begin with praise. We begin with praise because I need praise when I'm getting feedback. And so I am logically, transplanting my needs onto them. And perhaps some of them don't need praise, but most of them do. And they all appreciate understanding why we do things the way we do things. One example that I love to give my workshop is this. So typically in a workshop, ideally it's under 10 students, but we live in the real world, so often it's more than that. But you're getting feedback as a student writer. You've handed in a short story, say. You're going to get feedback from 15 people, your peers, and your professor. One thing I'm always telling them is when you read this feedback, keep in mind, you cannot and should not take all of the advice because not everybody is reading this story in the right way. And not everyone is reading this story and giving you feedback to make it the best version of itself it can be. Some people, because they're still learning how to be critics, some people say, well, if I'd written this story, I'd have done it this way. That's not useful to me because you didn't write the story and that's not the story I wanted to write. So I remind them of that. I tell them, you cannot please anyone. And plus, if you did please everyone, you would end up with something that was so smoothed over and milquetoast that it would become a shiny, smooth, white ball. Like, that's fine, but that's not, what is it, right? It shouldn't be something that appeals to everyone. No art appeals to everyone. Art is subjective. So that's one thing that I tell them. And then I often give them, when we're talking about feedback and how to listen to it or not to listen to it, I often give them the anecdote of a former professor of mine who handed in his first novel to his editor, and it was 500 pages. And the editor read it and came back to him and said, we love it. It's perfect. You got to cut 200 pages. So he took the novel and he worked on it for a year and he handed it back in and it was 750 pages. And his editor said, perfect. So, and my point is there, sometimes even an expert in the room like me might say, this is the right thing to do for this story. And sometimes even I am going to be wrong. But the point is, something's missing trust yourself. If you know what the thing is that's missing, it could be that everybody in workshop said things that weren't right, but what they said led you to a different solution. Trust yourself. You're the one who's making the art. Trust yourself.
We're running low on time. I want to lightning round some questions really quick.
Okay.
First book you ever truly loved?
Oh, that is so hard. I would say the first book that really blew my mind, that I had to start over, In the Lake of the Woods by Tim O'Brien. I finished that book and I started it again immediately because I was so confused and so in awe of what he'd done. There were many books that I had loved beforehand, but there was something really almost spiritual about the process of reading and finishing that book. And I've taught it now a million times, but In the Lake of the Woods, a near perfect book.
If you could assign one novel to every incoming UK freshman, what would it be?
Oh, that is so fascinating. Boy, every incoming... You're going to have to edit out the silence for this to be a lightning round. That is such a good question. Because I'm thinking of all the different types of students that we have here and wanting to do something strange, unusual, but not so difficult that it turns a student off from reading and writing. Oh, man. I don't think I have an answer for that. I don't think there is one book that it would just be, can't do it.
Fair enough. Writing late at night or writing early in the morning or?
Writing all the time.
All the time.
Absolutely. I love that people have very particular dedicated writing habits. I do not. So I think writing whenever you can is the best practice.
Most memorable piece of writing advice you ever received?
Don't be lazy. Ann Beattie told me that. She said, you're being lazy. Stop being lazy. Try harder. You can do better. She was absolutely right. I felt it was like somebody had put a mirror in front of me. I knew exactly what she was talking about, even though in my mind I was saying, no, I'm not. Yes, I was absolutely being lazy. Best advice I ever got.
You have a new project, a next project, something else that you're already working on?
Literary thriller. Obviously, always trying something new. I love reading thrillers. I love Stephen King. And when you mentioned him earlier, Megan Abbott is another favorite. And I think a little while ago, I just had the realization, I love reading these books. Why don't I try them? I don't think I'm going to be good at it, but that is a challenge and I love challenges. So I'm working on a literary thriller.
I love that you want to just push into new areas all the time and just...
I got to keep it interesting, man.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I don't want to take up, we could talk for quite some time, but Hannah Pittard, thank you so much. Your new novel, If You Love It, Let It Kill You, is available now wherever books are sold, wherever books are in libraries, wherever you
local
have
bookstores,
a local bookstore, a friend who has the book that you borrow and
absolutely
hopefully give back. You can also find her in the classroom here at UK, helping shape new voices in literature. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Blue. Behind the Blue is a joint production of the University of Kentucky and UK Healthcare. For more stories about UK and UK healthcare, visit uknow.uky.edu.